All right, tonight gaming is in session, and we have Moss Book One taking the stand to defend itself. Moss Book One is developed and put out by PolyArc, the people who developed it for PSVR One and Quest and things like that. It comes in at a price of $20, and we were fortunately provided a review copy by PolyArc, so thank you for that. Tonight, Moss Book One will be defending itself on one count of polishing the mechanic, another count of deja vu, and a third count of extreme brevity. So you probably already know what we're going to be talking about tonight, but we'll go through it. We have to go through the process here. So, looking at the first count of polishing mechanics. Moss, for those who don't know, is a diorama action adventure with gameplay that's kind of like an extended Zelda dungeon, with each room in this diorama containing a puzzle that you have to get through. That's not to say that you're in a dungeon the entire time. You're walking through the environment. You're walking through your character's village. But every scenario is presented almost like a little dioramatic view where you're moving from left to right in this environment, which is nice in VR because you have a VR headset on. You can lean, you can stand, you can move around and really investigate the scenery, and that scenery is static, which creates a nice, it doesn't really affect the mechanics too much, but it's a nice presentation for this type of game that just as a novel take on it, more or less. You play as a combination of a person called the Reader and a small adventurous mouse named Quill, who is setting out to rescue her uncle. Throughout the game, in these dioramatic things, you're going to be fighting enemies with, relatively simple but still engaging combat. But you're mainly going to be tackling puzzles. How do I get from point A to point B using a series of levers and switches, or maybe utilizing some, extra help from quote-unquote the Reader, who you will be inhabiting using your two PSVR2 Sense controllers. Now, having mentioned the Sense controllers, I'm going to be talking about this in a review of kind of, my experiences. I played through the game handily in PSVR 1 where you're using the DualShock controller. Now you're using the Sense controller, and I will say that on PSVR 2 the game is certainly much more comfortable. It's always awkward moving the DualShock around, grabbing things while holding the DualShock, interacting with the environment with the DualShock, but you needed the DualShock so that you could move around with the analog sticks as well. So the game's more comfortable with the Sense controllers, but I will say it's not notably different aside from a few small combat changes where I just found it easier. With the DualShock, you have one little glowing representation of yourself in the game to interact with the environment. With the Sense controllers, you now have two representations of yourself in the game, meaning that I can interact with the environment as the Reader and grab a block and move it, while with my other hand, I could be holding on to an enemy and preventing them from moving, and still use the thumbstick to have Quill moving around the environment as well. It didn't come into play too much where I felt like I had too much power, but certainly in situations with combat where, the way that you heal your little mouse friend is by putting your hand over your friend, hitting the button, and it recharges your health, but it takes a little bit of time. So when you also have another free hand that can grab an enemy to pause the enemy, that gives you all the time you need. So those kind of things are a bit easier in the PSVR 2 version. It's probably the same thing present in other versions of the game, but it wasn't present in the PSVR 1 version. But we're talking about polishing the mechanics here. This is a game that's polished to the gills. The haunting soundtrack times perfectly with the adventure. It's something I'd walk into a new environment, I'd hear just the right absolute tone of music to present the feeling that you're supposed to be feeling in that environment, whether it's something you're supposed to be, awing in the vastness of an area, or spooked by the darkness and spookiness of an area, or just suddenly feeling an upswelling of adventure. The soundtrack just fits perfectly with what you're supposed to be doing at that given time, and it even drives you to a degree to kind of help you figure out what's supposed to be going on. And Quill's mechanics, of course, feel solid. One thing I really like about this game is that although you are this light and dainty mouse, this rather delicate creature, they gave Quill a certain amount of inertia in her mechanics, so you're moving around. It makes the game feel more real and more solid than you normally see in these kind of action adventure type games. So she has inertia. You move in one way, you turn left, you kind of have a little bit of movement before she starts moving left. Especially when you jump, you feel that weight. It goes a long way to making you feel connected to this diorama that you've dropped in, this world that you've dropped in and you're looking at. And it's odd how such a small character feels heavy, and that somehow feels right. And of course, PSVR2 comes with it the visual clarity, which is a great thing. It's been a while since I played Moss on PSVR1, but playing it on PSVR2, everything is sharp, everything is clear, nothing is kind of embarrassing. The textures all look very nice and modern. And it ultimately, when you see games like this that are remade for new systems, ultimately what's happening is Moss is looking like the game that I remembered it to be without having that kind of degradation. But with that, I find Moss on the count of polishing mechanics guilty. Adam, do you have any cross examination questions?
So, which one of these four things you mentioned would you think would be the strongest evidence, and why me, who's already played it in PSVR, would play it again in PSVR 2?
That's a tough question, Adam, and I'll kind of get to that a little bit later. But of the four things I mentioned to you, the visual clarity, it's not going to wow you again necessarily. It still looks like Moss Book 1. You don't really go for the soundtrack too much. The mechanics don't really get you. So I do think having the two dual sense controllers and the lack of that awkwardness of the dual shock that you had to use originally. Also, the ability to look around the environments is a lot easier now that we don't have that crappy camera tracking. We're now using the inside out tracking. So when I did need to lean forward, when I did need to reach far to grab an object, it was less of a will I be able to do this and more of a yeah, let's do this. Let me bend all the way around this environment as opposed to let me just tilt my head a little bit and get the most I can out of it. I think that's going to be the biggest difference for you. Just overall a more comfortable experience.
Nice. Well, yeah, let's move on to the next second count.
All right. On the second count, we have one count of deja vu. So, no surprise here. The game is basically the same as it is on the PSVR 1. It looks mostly the same. At least it looks the way you remember it to. It feels mostly the same, although the two sense controllers help out a little bit with comfort. But as I said before, it's more of a case of it looking how I remembered it to look. Um, However, it was nice to organically run through this game again, and I did find the DLC elements that popped out in the PSVR 1 version that I never went back to revisit it. So, for those that don't know, after Moss Book 1 came out, they released a DLC, Twilight Garden. I think it was free DLC, it might have just been cheap DLC. But to play this DLC, you have to play through the game again and find these. They're supposed to be hidden. They're not really hidden. They're right in front of you. But find these portals, these three different portals throughout the environment that takes you to another land called the Twilight Garden that has three different challenge rooms. And I never played this in the PSVR 1, so playing through, it was a nice surprise. So for those who maybe played Moss Book 1 when it first came out, never touched it again, this is something that's going to be nice to run into. These rooms are more difficult than anything else you see in the game. The enemies are stronger, there are more enemies, and it also introduces new mechanics that you don't normally encounter in Moss through the standalone, and you get new equipment, which gives you new abilities, which are almost game breaking in terms of what power they give you, but it's still fun. It also includes finally one boss fight that is probably the best boss fight in the game, which is kind of lacking. This game doesn't have very many boss fights, but it has a very nice, engaging, and fun boss fight at the end. So that alone is kind of worth the price of going through this again. However, ultimately, I'm playing Moss Book 1 again. Everything I saw, even though it's been years, it felt like something I'd seen before, save for maybe one or two segments. The second time around, unfortunately, the story seems to lack a bit of the charm that was present on the first run. When you first play Moss, it's like you're reading a children's book. Now you're playing it again, and that children's book mechanic, the tone, kind of rings a little bit hollow now, and it's a bit pandering almost at sometimes. Maybe I'm being too harsh. I personally have probably just read way too many children's books in between the time that Moss first came out, when I only had one very small kid, and now Moss has come out again, and my kids have grown, and I've gone through all the books with them. So one of these elements that Moss really relied on seems to not be worth the revisit in that regard. All you did before in Moss Book 1, you're basically going to be doing again in Moss Book 2. And for that, I find, on the count of deja vu, Moss Book 1 guilty. Adam, any questions?
So, for most players, is this additional Twilight Garden DLC worth replaying the whole game just to do it?
I'm going to say, if you are looking for a reason to play through Moss Book 1 again, yeah, probably. If you're not looking for a reason, you don't feel inclined to play it again, or you really you don't have a reason to go through it again, it's probably not going to be enough to push you over the edge and make you feel glad that you did it again. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah.
All
That's all
right.
I got.
And we have a short argument for the last count on the count of extreme brevity. Um, I will just say, playing through Moss again, even though it was years ago when I last touched it, the game went by very quickly. The puzzles were easier to solve, maybe just because I knew I had solved them before. I never really got stuck. Even the new challenge puzzles that I encountered in the Twilight Garden, those they were better. They were more fun to solve, but they were still nothing brutal to solve. Nothing that made me pause for more than maybe one or two iterations of attempts. Um, all told, you could easily play Moss Book 1 in one sitting. Personally, I clocked in at around 3 hours, and I think that's my PlayStation rounding up a bit and how much time I spent in the game. Although, again, granted, this is my second playthrough. For me personally, there was felt like little reason to go back again once I finished it. So I finished it the second time. I start the game again. I actually accidentally started the game again, seeing if there was more content, and it's the exact same thing, exact same story. Maybe the only thing you look for is to try to find the hidden scrolls in each environment, but that sounds to me more tedious because I'm going to be going through all this ground that I already trod before. There's also bonuses if you find all of the sparkly things in the destructible environments, but nothing there really compels me to continue. The game is charming, it's enjoyable to be in, but when I was done, I was done. Um, that being said, I'm glad I had a reason to revisit it. It had been long enough to where it felt kind of fresh to me, and it wasn't boring going through it again. I still had a lot of fun going through it again, but it didn't quite reach the same highs that it did the first time I played the game. So yeah, 3 hours, $20, 3 hours of gameplay, and then you're pretty much done with it for another 5, 6 years, something like that. So on the account of extreme brevity, I find Moss Book Part 1 guilty. Adam, any questions there before my final statements?
No, I'm curious about this final statement. Let's move on.
Yeah, for my closing statement, I ultimately have three questions. What if you have already owned and played Moss on the PSVR? And what if you haven't played it before? The real question is, Moss is a must-play game for the PSVR. But is Moss a must-play game again? A must-play again? These are the questions rattling around in my head as somebody who's now played it again. But my final verdict for Moss, on the charge of a game being worthy of your purchase, we find the jury hung. It's a hung jury on Moss Book 1. Now, Adam, I don't know if this is a surprise to you. Maybe I led into that a bit too much. I love Moss. I think Moss is great. And it's only $20. For some reason, I thought it was $40 going into it. It's only $20, which is not a steep purchase. But the real trouble with Moss is that even on the PSVR2, the enhanced haptics, the head rumble, which seemed to pop up every once in a while, none of that makes the game feel new enough to make it worthy of a purchase again, especially if you had it on a PSVR 1 and you feel like you saw and did it all. That's why I have to make it a hung jury. It's not a not guilty, right? If you've never played Moss, this is the way to play Moss, bar none. You need to play Moss. $20 is a great price of entry to be able to experience Moss. Like I said, it's a must-play game, but I don't think it's necessarily a must-play again.